Welcome to the Writer's Journey podcast. I'm Michael Laron, a science fiction and fantasy author on a journey to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I pull back the curtain on my writing life and how I'm building a writing career while working a full-time job, raising a family, and attending law school classes in the evenings. You can find show notes for this week's episode, a free starter library of my fiction, and much more at michaellaron.com. Hello and welcome to episode 92. 92 is a good number, and in this week's episode, I'm going to talk about a new writing technique or an interesting writing technique that I heard about that I wanted to talk a little bit more about because I had some ideas about it. But first, in writing news, things are going great. I just finished Reaper's Way, book 1.5 in my Good Necromancer series. So that is done. It took a little bit longer than I thought, but I'm ultimately glad that I finished it. It came up a little bit short compared to what I thought it would be too. I thought it would be around 20,000 words, but it ended up being around 16,000 words, which not too bad at the end of the day. I mean, it's still a novella and still definitely another book under my belt, which I am super happy with. So this coming Monday, I am set to begin production on Cold Hard Magic, which is book 2 in the Good Necromancer series. So my ultimate goal with that one is to try to have that done by the time I start my next law class at the end of January, but we'll see. You know, every novel's different and every production is different. Usually with my book 2s, knock on wood, production goes a lot faster than it did with book 1. So we'll just kind of play it by ear and see how that's going. But writing wise, couldn't be happier with the fact that I finished another book, and in law news, I'm still waiting on my grade for my final exam for this employment law class that I just finished. Feels good to be done with that, and it feels kind of weird to have a Tuesday and Thursday night where I'm not going to class, but I've definitely taken advantage of it and gotten some more writing time done. And I got a weird email from my university bookstore. So it turns out that the books for this class that I'm taking next semester, copyright law, are already available. And that's almost unheard of. Usually they're not available until after Christmas and sometimes early January. So I ordered the books, got them, and I've started reading for copyright law, which is my next class next semester. And the reason I wanted to get a jump on it is because this book is double the length of the employment law book. So my employment law book was 600 pages. This is 1,200 pages. I'm not sure if we'll read all of it, but I'm going to try to at least get a jump on it. I've always found that if you read too much, that's usually a better problem to have than to fall behind on your reading. So copyright law was the second reason that I took law school, that I went to law school. So when I went to law school, I said, okay, yeah, I'm going to take some of these other classes and the prerequisites and all that. But I'm really only going for 2 reasons. The first reason was employment law. And that's what I just took this past semester, because you're going to have to hire people as a writer if you're treating this as a business. And at some point you might have an employee or you might have an independent contractor relationship. And so having an understanding of employment law, I think, is critically important. And then the second reason I took law classes was because of copyright law, because copyright is how writers make money. It's how we make our livelihoods. Having an understanding of it can bolster your career or it can destroy your career. So if you sign a bad contract with a traditional publisher and you didn't negotiate, that could hamstring your career, right? So I don't ever want to put myself in a situation down the road when I'm more successful that I sign an awful contract because I didn't know what I was doing. And I feel like the writers who really understand copyright are playing in a totally different ballpark. That's a ballpark I want to play in. So I am super excited about this course. It's taught by a practicing intellectual property attorney who actually, I think, has represented authors. So this is going to be a really, really great experience. Like I'm super excited. I've dug into the first few cases, and it's weird because all the cases are like about video games and movies and streaming. And I'm like, it's so weird to see like modern technology described in such a stuffy way in a law book. But hey, that's how it goes, and at least it'll make for some fun readings. That's makes the reading a lot easier. So that's what I'm working on, hoping to have the book done by the end of January, the reading done. That probably won't happen, but I will definitely be done with the reading well ahead of schedule compared to the rest of compared to the probably what the syllabus will be. So that's law news. That things are relatively quiet, but in work news, things are really, really busy at work for me for some reason. It seems like the moment law classes ended, work was like, okay, we're going to be busier. It's weird how the universe works. It's like your personal life is quiet, the writing life is quiet, and then the work life is just crazy, right? And then once the work life dies down, then the personal life gets crazy, and then that dies down, and then it's just weird. I'm just grateful that everything is not crazy at once. It makes it a lot more easier to manage, and definitely less stressful. So I did want to talk about something, a very nice comment that a reader gave me over the past weekend, and it was honestly one of the nicest comments anyone's ever said about my YouTube channel. And it's one of those comments that just makes you grin ear to ear and just makes you feel good for the rest of the day. So somebody wrote on one of my YouTube videos that I was like the Bob Ross of writing or self-publishing. And when I read it, I started laughing because I'm like, you can't compare somebody to Bob Ross. I mean, Bob Ross is a legend. I mean, I watched his painting shows as a kid, and he's kind of like the Mr. Rogers of the creative world, right? I mean, just super good heart and all that. And it was just kind of funny that somebody would compare me to Bob Ross. It was kind of cool. So I actually ended up going on YouTube and watching a bunch of Bob Ross videos, and he's one of those he's great to watch because it's really not about the painting. Like, yeah, you watch the painting videos and you want to see how he makes these mountains and all that, but I think it's really about what he's talking about when he's painting. I think that's pretty cool. So yeah, anyway, I would never compare myself to Bob Ross, but I just thought it was a really, really nice compliment. And yeah, definitely one of the most different compliments I've gotten on my channel. So I always like to share that stuff because as a writer, you never really know the impact you have on people, and you never really know how people are going to receive your work. And it's always cool to hear that my work is being received positively out there in the world. So good vibes. So what I wanted to spend the rest of the episode talking about was in response to an interview that I heard on the Creative Pen podcast this past week. And it was an interview with Kevin J. Anderson. And Kevin J. Anderson is a New York Times best-selling writer. He is an extremely prolific writer. He's one of the ones that I've followed for quite some time. He's kind of cut from the same cloth as Dean Wesley Smith. I think he's written over 150 books. Many of those have become bestsellers, and he does writes a lot of fiction, but he's one that will write some nonfiction about writing, and he always makes for a really good interview. And he was doing an interview with Joanna Penn, and he was talking about dictation. And that's probably not a huge shocker to any of you listening. Dictation it's almost mainstream now. I mean, everybody's covered it to some degree on their podcast. There are books out there on dictation. I think there's even like a writing course on dictation, if I'm correct. So dictation is one of those things where it's in the mainstream. It's not like writing on your phone. Writing on your phone is still, people kind of go bug-eyed when they hear that. But dictation is pretty common. But he mentioned that he had a book on it, and it was a little book. It was called On Being a Dictator, which is a great title. So I went off and I grabbed it, and I was reading it, and some light bulbs were going off in my head as I was going through this book. And I'll drop a link to Kevin's interview with Joanna Penn, as well as a link to this book On Being a Dictator. It'll be an affiliate link. What he was basically talking about was his process for dictating, which was very similar to the process that I followed. So I actually have dictated an entire series. So I dictated an entire series Into the Dark, so I didn't have any kind of outline. So my last Dragonlord series, featuring my evil dragon, Old Dark, that was dictated. I don't talk about that very much, but I actually dictated that, and I dictated it on Dragon, the software. So it's like the greatest coincidence ever, right? I wrote a book called Old Dark, Into the Dark, and I dictated it on Dragon. A book about dragons on Dragon. It's just kind of funny. I still laugh about that every time I say it. But yeah, so essentially, I learned how to dictate, and I learned how to dictate without ever putting my fingers on the keyboard, and I did that into the dark, which was, now that I think about it, a fairly unique way to write a novel. Definitely not for the faint of heart. If you're a beginner, I would definitely not recommend that. I mean, I think beginners can handle a lot, especially if you're motivated and if you're ambitious and you're driven. But that's not something I would recommend for a beginner. And even then, I was maybe in a little over my head. But anyway, so he was talking about dictating, but he doesn't dictate using Dragon. That's what I thought was more interesting. So I thought what he was going to say was, well, I dictate and I use Dragon and so on and so forth. But he actually doesn't do that. He dictates into a recorder, and then he sends the MP3 recording of his dictation to a transcriptionist. And then the transcriptionist transcribes what he dictated, and they clean it up and they make it look good. They make it look like fiction, and then they send it back to him. And then at that point, it's up to him to go do editing however he wants to do it. And the reason I was surprised by that, there were a couple things that were kind of going through my head. The first thing is that the problem with Dragon, if any of you have used Dragon or if you are familiar with it, Dragon is really, really good software. The problem with Dragon, though, is that if you're not careful, you spend a lot of time cleaning up what you've just dictated, right? So if there's a certain special kind of way you have to talk to Dragon, like you can't talk to it like I'm talking to you right now. You have to talk to it, comma, and say, comma, open quote, Dragon, please let me know what you think about this, comma, end quote, I said, period, right? That's how you have to talk about it. So I had to learn how to do that. Like, it's super awkward, right? But when you're dictating into a recording, you don't have to do that. You can talk naturally, and you can rely on a transcriptionist to be able to listen to that and be able to understand when you're changing your voice, whether this is dialogue or whether it's not dialogue, right? So that part was particularly intriguing to me, because the reason I don't dictate anymore was because of that cleanup. It just any time you save in dictating and getting the words on the page, you instantly lose when you have to start cleaning up everything, even if you dictate fairly accurately. And I was a fairly accurate dictator. So yeah, so he was talking about that. And then the next thing that was going off in my head was dollar signs. I'm like, oh gosh, how much does this cost? So I did some research, and it actually, for a 50,000 word novel, now this was just based on some rough math. It could be more than this, or it actually could be less than this. But the basic math that I came up with is that the services that I looked at cost about a penny a word, right? So that's could be good, could be expensive, but it would cost about $500 to transcribe a novel. So if you think about a 50,000 word novel, it's probably going to cost about $500, right? That is a little expensive because when you think about that, that's also on top of editing. So just because the transcriptionist works on it, you still got to go through it and make it into your own style visually, right? And you still got to go through and edit some things. So that introduces a considerable extra step in the process and some extra money in the process, which was why I initially thought, I don't know if I like that process, because it's going to take me, 1.5 times more or longer and more money to produce a book. But one of the things that I think is a benefit about this process is that it does free you up. Because if you think about it, in this interview, he was talking about how he dictates it. He doesn't just sit at a desk and dictate. Right? He dictates when he's on walks. He dictates when he's going on a hike in the woods, right? He does that every day. He's fortunate enough to do that every day, and he'll go on a hour-long walk with his dog, right? And that's when he's dictating. That's when the light bulb started going off over my head, right? Because then, if you think about that, you're technically using time that you wouldn't have been able to write otherwise. Like when you're writing on your phone, you are writing in a time that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to write. Like you can't bring your desktop to the doctor's office, right? And you're probably not going to bring your laptop to the doctor's office while you're waiting to be seen in that 5-minute period when the nurse leaves and the doctor comes in, but you can write on your phone in that period, right? So the same thing I think applies if you're out on a walk or if you're exercising at the gym. That's reclaimed writing time. That's how I see it, right? And so then I started thinking, that's interesting. That feels awfully futuristic. If you think about it, there could be a totally different writing workflow that somebody could adopt if they wanted to that involved dictation. And let me explain what I mean. So just think about the context switching. So for example, let me give you a hypothetical example. So let's say that I wake up at 5:30 in the morning and I come downstairs and I start writing my novel on my desktop. And then it's time to go to work. So I save my work on my desktop and then Scrivener automatically syncs it to my iPhone. So when I'm on breaks at work or I am at the doctor's office or I'm in the backseat of an Uber car, I whip out my phone and I make more progress on my novel, right? That's a context switch because if you think about it, my full attention is on my desktop. When I'm pulling out my phone, I'm multitasking and I'm doing other things, right? So I'm working on my phone in pockets throughout the day, and then when I'm off work and I'm going on a walk, taking my dog on an extra long walk, I could start dictating, use an app on my phone, and get Bluetooth headsets or something, and dictate into that while I'm walking, picking up where I left off on my phone. And then I get home and send that to a transcriptionist, go to bed. By the time I wake up, the transcriptionist is probably finished with the chapters that I sent to them, and then I do it all over again. That's an interesting workflow for a busy person. Now, some people probably are like, "Oh my gosh, that's kind of crazy," but that could be the future. You know, you think about Scrivener iOS. The reason I think that's so popular is because it's almost like the Nintendo Switch of writing, right? Because the Nintendo Switch, the cool thing is that you can game on the go. The cool thing with Scrivener iOS is that you can write on the go, right? So wouldn't it be interesting if you could dictate on the go? And the future is being able to write no matter what your context is, no matter what your surrounding is. If you're in a coffee shop, you write based on the device that's most convenient for you at the time. It's going to be different than if you're at home. It's going to be different than if you're at the gym. It's going to be different than if you're in the car, for example. So I've just always found that interesting. And I do think that there's something to that. There's something futuristic about that. And it also got me thinking about how dictation could really be an emerging tech for parts of the world that don't have access to computers or word processors, right? So it's probably read all the time about like how countries in Africa don't have desktops or laptops. They skipped the computer revolution, and now a lot of people have phones. That's how they communicate. That's how they make their livelihood. And so I wonder if dictation, once it becomes a little bit cheaper and the technology becomes a little bit better, if that's going to open up a whole new generation of writers to be able to tell stories with their voice. Voice technology, it's starting to get its legs. And so I wonder if that's not a viable way in the future that people are going to be able to tell stories, because I really do think that people are going, in the next 10 to 15 years, people are going to start wanting to distance themselves from their smartphones. I think that the medical evidence is in. I think that being on your phone all day probably has some adverse medical consequences. I think people are going to want to try to be able to do more while spending less time on their phones. And that's why I think voice is going to be pretty important. And I think that voice could also, I think that the dictation that we see today could just be scratching the surface of what it can truly do in the future. And then that got me thinking about more future tech, right? So Dragon is AI based, right? It's software. It uses artificial intelligence either on your desktop or in the cloud to translate what you've just spoken onto the page in the form of words. The technology is pretty good today, but I think it's going to get better. And I think eventually there will be dictation AI that will help you with fiction, right? Because that's also one of the issues with Dragon is that it's not set up for fiction. There's Dragon for legal, there's Dragon for home, there's Dragon for medical, but there's not Dragon for creatives, right? And I do think that somebody's going to crack that nut at some point. And so if you can dictate and have the AI understand when your voice is changing, and when you're inflecting your voice to determine, when to put those quotes in, and you can start talking to your AI or to your software naturally, I think that's when things are probably going to start taking off. And eventually the AI is going to replace transcriptionists. There's not going to be a need in probably 10 to 15 years to even think about hiring a transcriptionist, which means the cost is going to go down, which means that this type of dictation is going to be even more accessible for people in the future. And so then I started thinking, well, okay, future tech, that makes sense. Cost of the barrier to entry is going to go down. That makes sense. And then I thought, okay, but the really big barrier I think that people are going to have with this type of method, with dictation, is the fact that they can't see their book, right? Because historically we're taught that when you want to write a novel, you want to sit down and you actually type it out, or at least you can see it on your phone, right? I think to write a novel blind or anything blind, I think scares people because it feels like you're not in any kind of control. And so I wonder if voice technology will have a solution for that, right? So like, for example, if I'm in the middle of dictating my book and I need to recall something that happened in a previous chapter. Well, how am I going to do that? Because I'm probably walking and I may not have access to my phone, or I may not have a phone, right? I may not be using a phone anymore. And so how do I find out what just happened in chapter 2? You might be able to ask whatever software you're using, hey, Dragon, what color was my character's hair in chapter 2? And then Dragon will instantly return a result and basically tell you your character's hair was red, right? Or you might say, rewind and play chapter 2, right? Or play a specific section in chapter 2, and then it'll play it for you. You'll hear it, and then you'll be able to continue dictating, right? So that's going to allow you to be able to write on the go, even though you can't see what's going on in front of you, right? And so then once you've dictated it, and then it gets transcribed, that's when you'll be able to actually see it and actually edit it. Anyway, that was very interesting. It's always cool when you hear an interview with somebody or you read a book with someone, and then ideas start going off in your head about the future promises of technology. I really do think that there's more to dictation that we haven't explored yet. I've thought about doing the transcription route myself in the future for one of my series, just to see how it works, because I really do think that it could be a really liberating way to write a novel. And if you're dictating while you're taking walks or taking hikes, it's a pretty good way to get healthy. And another fun fact, I was reading this book on being a dictator, and Kevin J. Anderson has a co-author who helped him write this book. And I forget the co-author's name. It's terrible that I forgot it. But he talked about something that he did that about made me fall out of my chair. I'm like, this is like next level, like makes you shake in your boots kind of thing. So he was talking about how he does this, I think it's called the Instant Story Show, where he'll go to a conference and try to show people how cool dictation is and talk about their unique method of dictation. And what he would do is he would have someone in the audience, I think, like pull a name out of a hat or pull a character out of a hat, and then he would have the audience say, he would say to the audience, I'm going to write a story, right? And I'm going to dictate that entire story for the next hour live in front of you. I have no idea what the story is going to be about. I won't know until I start speaking, and I want you to tell me what I'm going to write. And so the people pick the name out of a hat or they yell it to him, and then I guess he's got a headset on his ear, and he would actually dictate an entire story, start to finish, into the dark, in front of a crowd of like 1,000 people. Just think about that for a second. Just let that sink in, right? Dictating a book on stage into the dark without having any idea what you're going to write about, and the audience picks what you're going to write about. That blew my mind. Like I told you, I literally almost fell out of my chair. That's next level storytelling, right? I mean, that requires an incredible amount of skill. That's like Bob Ross style. I mean, you're literally painting a picture on television in front of millions of people. What if you make a mistake, or what if you say something that looks bad? I don't know. That shocked me. But then I thought that could be a really, really cool thing to do at a conference, or could be even a really, really cool thing to do on YouTube, right? If I ever got the hang of this. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there for this week, but I hope that you found something interesting in that. I definitely recommend that you check out Kevin J. Anderson's podcast interview and this book on being a dictator. Like I said, I'll drop links to it in the show notes. Wherever you all are, I hope that you are having a phenomenal week. Hope that you're well, and take care, peace, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy my backlist episodes at michaelaran.com/podcast. For your free starter library of my favorite novels, join my fan club by visiting michaelaran.com/fanclub. If you're a writer and want to connect with me further, check out my YouTube channel, Author Level Up, for helpful writing advice at authorlevelup.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.